Howdy folks, I'm Ben Starr, the ultimate food geek. Welcome back to my kitchen. Today I am going to address the single most common question, and I get it almost every day, about my simple sourdough technique, and that is, when and how do I add inclusions or additions? Because let's face it folks, if you're baking the same old plain loaf of sourdough bread day in and day out for weeks and months, your starter might leave you for somebody a little bit more kinky. Variety is the spice of life. And when it comes to thinking about what kinds of things to add to your sourdough loaf to spice things up, the sky is the limit. Once you open those floodgates, there is no closing them. Now, before we talk about the actual technique, I want to just give you a few ideas for inspiration as to the types of things that you can add to your sourdough bread. Now, the first thing that might come to your mind is fresh or dried herbs and spices. I use fresh rosemary from my garden in more loaves than I bake plain. I'm almost always baking rosemary sourdough bread. It doesn't have to be fresh though. Dried herbs and spices and seeds work just as well. Think mustard seeds or caraway seeds. Or you can go a little bit more diverse with everything bagel seasoning or za'atar. I also get a lot of you who grind your own flour at home and you're asking me for recipes for simple sourdough using home milled flour. Hint, they don't exist. Home milled flour isn't good for baking. But there is a way that you can incorporate whole grains into this loaf without having to use whole wheat flour, which translates into higher hydration and a lot more complicated techniques for baking sourdough. You just use cooked whole grains and add them to your sourdough made with white flour. Any grain will do. I love buckwheat, I love barley, but wheat and rye and whole oats are also great. You just want to make sure that they are fully cooked and well drained before they go into the mix. You can make a beautiful olive loaf or one that's filled with roasted red peppers. You can even go a little more exotic with some mushrooms, even like wild mushrooms like this. If you're using fresh mushrooms, you want to cook them, of course, before they go into the bread. But if you're using dehydrated wild mushrooms, you just want to reconstitute them first. These morels that I foraged a couple of months ago in Oklahoma would be incredible in a loaf of sourdough. You also don't have to stick to the savory side of the spectrum. You can go sweet. Chocolate chips, dried or fresh fruits, even cocktail cherries would make a really cool, interesting loaf. Don't forget about the huge spectrum of cheeses, either super aged like this beautiful 4-year Parmigiano Reggiano, or even fresh cheeses like goat cheese make a really, really delicious sourdough loaf. Today though, I am going to be sticking to two of my very favorite augmented sourdough loaves, jalapeno and sharp cheddar cheese, and then a separate one doing whole roasted garlic cloves. Now there are two potential modifications to the simple sourdough recipe based on the additions that you are adding. You need to consider the hydration or the amount of water or liquid in your dough, and you also need to consider salinity, because some of these additions are going to add their own salt to the party, and some of them are going to add, and quite possibly, a considerable amount of water. It's pretty easy to end up with a dough that's just too wet to work with when you're using wet ingredients like roasted red peppers or olives or pickled jalapeños. So there are some factors to take into consideration as we modify the recipe based on what we're putting into the dough. Now, I'm gonna be honest, I almost always wing it. I'll look at the amount of ingredients I'm about to put in and say, you know what, that's pretty wet. I think I'm gonna back off 2 ounces on the water. But I also realize that not all of you have been baking for most of your lives. So today I'm gonna do some real life demonstrations to hopefully guide you toward your own level of experimentation to where you can develop your own recipes for the exact flavor additions that you like and make sure that that loaf succeeds for you. As to the question of when to add inclusions, the answer is 99% of the time, you're gonna add them when you initially mix the ingredients together. The only scenario in which you will need to add your ingredients toward the end of the process, like right before shaping, before the final rise and baking, is if your ingredients are extremely delicate and they won't survive that initial mixing process without breaking apart. And one of those scenarios is these beautiful, delicate roasted garlic cloves. These would turn into mush and just distribute throughout the bread, and don't get me wrong, the bread would still be delicious. But my plan is to be able to slice into this loaf of bread and see these big, beautiful, whole, caramel-colored, golden, roasted garlic cloves in there waiting to be devoured. So when you've got delicate ingredients like this, or fresh berries, blueberries, or blackberries, something like that, where the ingredients would absolutely get completely disappeared into the dough as you're working it during the initial mixing process, those ingredients you will add after the bulk fermentation. And I'll show you how to do that later on in this video. But the overwhelming majority of ingredients that you are going to add are going to be mixed together during the initial mixing process. So let's talk about what we're working with today. I've got this giant can of pickled jalapenos to make my jalapeno cheddar loaf. And of course you can certainly use fresh jalapenos, that's fine. But I really do like that tang and pungency that a pickled jalapeno adds to sourdough bread. These jalapenos came already diced, which saves me a step, although you certainly can include them in rings. But when we're talking about an ingredient that's in small pieces like this, especially one that's wet, or one that's spicy, or one that is particularly pungent in flavor, I try to add not more than about roughly a cup's worth of volume of that ingredient to a regular loaf of simple sourdough. So this is going to be too many jalapenos for me. Now, we've got a lot of flavorful liquid in this can along with the jalapenos, and in some cases that liquid can be of great benefit to the flavor of your bread if you incorporate it in place of some of the water. That's especially the case with things like roasted green chilies and roasted red peppers. But in the case of salty pickled ingredients like pickled jalapenos or olives, you have to be careful using the liquid from that container because you can really quickly skyrocket the amount of salt in your recipe. So I'm going to let you advanced bakers cross that bridge through experimentation when you come to it. For me, I'm not going to use any of the pickling liquid from these jalapenos. But if I were, I would strain that liquid out and then weigh it and subtract it from the water addition of the recipe. And of course, you'll want to subtract some or all of the salt in the recipe if you're using an extremely salty liquid. But for me, I'm only going to be using some of these jalapenos and none of that liquid. And of course, we're weighing our ingredients today. Don't fight me on this, folks. Every single professional baker in the world bakes with a scale. Nobody bakes by sight or by volume except for your grandma, and she's been doing it for 75 years. So get yourself a scale if you want to have repeated, consistent success. My favorite scale is in the video description below. Just click where it says more. All right, I am going to eyeball roughly a cup into my bowl here, but I'm weighing it because I need to know how to adjust the moisture level in my recipe because these jalapenos are really wet and liquid is going to migrate out of them and into the body of the dough during bulk fermentation, adding to the hydration of the dough. So I absolutely have to compensate for the amount of water that we're adding to the dough based on the amount of liquid that's going to come out of these jalapenos. Okay, so I typically, as I said, will use about a cup, maybe a cup and a half if I'm feeling adventurous. That's about right, and that's 3.8. We're just going to go ahead and round it off to 4 ounces. So I'm going to be adding 4 ounces of wet pickled jalapenos to this recipe. And from lots of previous experience of adding wet ingredients to this dough, they add more water than you think, especially during that long initial first fermentation of up to 24 hours. So I'm going to compensate about 50% of the weight of this and subtract that from my water. So 4 ounces of pickled jalapenos, I'm going to take off 2 ounces from the 12 ounces of water in this recipe. Okay, so my jalapenos are accounted for. Now let's talk about the cheese. I've got this beautiful extra sharp cheddar cheese. Now this is not a super expensive high quality cheese, and you can tell that by the fact that it's orange. There's no such thing as orange cheese. If you see orange cheese at the market, it has been dyed that color, either using artificial food coloring or a ground up seed called annatto or achiote in Mexican cuisine. Way back in the 1700s, the quality of a cheese was judged by its color, and the deeper and richer the color was, it was assumed that the cows were grazing on richer pastures. Grass and all plants have a variety of pigments in them, primarily beta-carotenes, and that results in a slightly yellower, richer quality to cheese that's made with a high fat content from cows that grazed richly on fresh green grass. So back in the day, people started putting yellow and orange color into the cheese to convince people that it was made from really, really rich milk instead of lean skim milk, the cheapest stuff they could get their hands on. And that's where the practice of dyeing cheese began, and it has perpetuated to this day for some unknowable reason. But anyway, I like to cut my cheeses up into cubes about the size of my pinky nail, maybe ½ inch square. You certainly can shred your cheese or buy the package of pre-shredded cheeses, but understand that that's going to really disseminate into the dough as it bakes and pretty much vanish. So if you want to occasionally run into a nice crusty, melty bit of cheese in your bread, you definitely want to cut it into cubes. And now it's time to build our dough. Now, I'm not going to go into much detail on the actual simple sourdough process because I have plenty of videos that explain that, but if this is your first time watching one of my videos, in my sourdough world, we only feed our starter when we need to make more. We never feed it before we bake with it. We use it straight from the fridge, cold and sleepy. We don't knead, we don't fold, we don't slap. We let the bread make itself. It's beautiful. Subscribe to my channel if that sounds nice to you. All right, so we are taking our 4 ounces of 100% hydration sourdough starter. And now it's time for the water. We know that we are backing off 2 ounces because of the liquid that's in our jalapenos. So we're only going to add 10 ounces, and the other 2 ounces are going to come out of those jalapenos as everything ferments. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and break that starter up and get it kind of mixed in with the water to just get ahead of the mixing game here. Next, we're going to add our flour, 1 pound and 4 ounces. I'm just using all-purpose unbleached flour today. And next, our salt. Normally, this recipe calls for 3/4 of an ounce of kosher salt, which is a higher salt ratio than most sourdough recipes. We are well aware the higher salt content is the key to the flexibility of this recipe. Now, if I added the normal 3/4 of an ounce of salt and then added pickled jalapeños, which are very salty, and then sharp aged cheddar cheese, which is also very salty, this bread is gonna be too salty. But saltiness of an ingredient alone is not necessarily means to back off the salt content of the recipe. The salt in this cheese is not really gonna extract and come out into the dough because this cheese's moisture content is fairly low, certainly lower than that of the dough. And moisture and salinity like to seek equilibrium. But because the salt is locked up in this cheese, we're not going to have a lot of it pull out into the bulk of the dough. The same, however, cannot be said of our pickled jalapeños because their moisture content is much higher, and we're going to lose a lot of their moisture to the dough as the dough sits for the next 24 hours. As that moisture comes out, it's going to carry a lot of salt with it. So I definitely am going to back off on the salt. When I use a pickled ingredient like jalapeños or olives, I generally back off about 1/3 to 1/2 of the full salt content of the recipe. So instead of 0.7 ounces of salt, I am going to add 0.4. Any kind of salt works for this recipe as long as you measure it by weight. Okay, now it's time to add our inclusions. So in go the pickled jalapeños, and in goes the sharp cheddar cheese. Now, I really like to use a fork when I stir this together. I don't know why, I don't think there's a particular reason for that. I've just always done it that way. So I typically use a fork. Now we're going to bring all the ingredients together. And when it starts to get too stiff to stir, we switch to our hand. Now, again, this is technically a no-knead recipe, but we got to get that incorporated into a cohesive dough before it will rise properly. So we're going to gently knead this just for 20 or 30 seconds until it comes into a cohesive dough. Now remember, since we lowered our moisture content, this dough is going to feel quite a bit tougher than your normal loaf of simple sourdough. That's because that moisture is currently locked up in those jalapeños. But as the dough sits, the moisture is going to come out and disseminate into the matrix of the dough. So it's going to feel a little bit wrong to you if you have adjusted for the hydration of the recipe while you're kneading it right now. Don't let that trip you up. Go ahead and knead it even though it's stiff, because after it sits for 18 to 24 hours, it's going to be quite a bit more hydrated than it is right now. You'll be pretty shocked. All right. That looks good. Now I'm going to oil this bowl and forget about this bread for about 18 hours. Now, for those times when you are incorporating a very delicate ingredient like these roasted garlic cloves or some fresh berries, I'm going to demonstrate how you include those after the bulk fermentation. So I've got a regular recipe of simple sourdough here that's been fermenting since yesterday afternoon. And because I'm adding these ingredients after the bulk fermentation, they are not going to have as direct an impact on the hydration or salinity of the dough. So we want to follow the original recipe for simple sourdough if you are adding your inclusions after the bulk fermentation. No need to adjust that recipe. All right, I am going to flour my work surface here, and out comes our beautiful dough. Give your hands a nice flouring, or you can wet them alternatively. That will also prevent them from sticking. And now we are going to stretch this dough out into a nice big flat rectangle. Don't get in there and mush it or press it out, because then you're going to degas it and lose all of those beautiful carbon dioxide bubbles that are going to give us a nice texture once the bread rises in the oven. But you want to get it spread out fairly wide. Now, we're going to take about 2/3 of our inclusions here, and again, I've got maybe a cup or a little bit more, roughly. If you try to do too many, they're all going to spill out the side, which some are going to spill out the side anyway, but we are going to scatter them throughout about half of this rectangle of dough. And don't get too close to the edges, because if they're too close to the edge, then they'll just fall out when you're shaping. Now, if your ingredient was oily, get that oil off your hands before you proceed. Now, I'm going to fold this dough right back over. And I'm going to sort of reorient it in front of me. I'm going to stretch it out just a little bit more. Not too much now. Don't want to tear it open. Now, I'm going to take the rest of those garlic cloves and put them over half of this portion of the dough. But again, not getting too terribly close to the sides. Wash your hands again. Okay, now we're going to do this final fold to enclose the dough, and now it's time to shape our bread. Now, I want my baking vessel ready to accommodate this loaf as soon as it is shaped. So I'm going to go ahead and spray the pan. I'm going to get just a little bit more flour on my hands, and we're going to begin shaping this into a boule. Now, you don't have as much flexibility with this because you've got a fairly thin layer on top here that's separating the garlic from the outside of the dough. So the more you work it, the thinner that top layer is going to get, and the cloves are going to start popping out the top. You don't want that to happen, right? So you want to get this shaped in as few moves as possible while still getting a nice tight boule. So I'm just going to kind of tuck the edges under here to get this started. Get it into my approximate shape. And now I'm going to start doing my little turns, pulling it towards me along the countertop until I just begin to get it a little bit tight. And that is as far as I'm going to go. You can see this clove here really wants to pop out. All right, I'm going to transfer it to my Dutch. And now, just like usual, this is going to proof at room temperature for 90 minutes before we bake it. All right, our bread has baked and cooled, and it looks and smells delicious, but something you might notice is that we don't have quite as high a rise as we do with normal simple sourdough. This is always going to happen with this particular inclusion technique, where we are folding in delicate ingredients after the bulk fermentation. This is because we did not have the luxury of working that dough into a very tight boule that would actually crush those delicate roasted garlic cloves or whatever other delicate ingredients we have inside our loaf. As we work the dough into the tight boule, we are strengthening the gluten network. This is called strength building, and it's what in high hydration recipes you do when you're folding and slapping and turning that dough multiple times during the bulk fermentation. That boule shaping process is partly strength building, but also when we create a really, really tight skin around the outside of that boule, that provides structure to the dough to hold it in shape as it rises. But because we have to be so delicate when we're shaping this boule, we just don't get quite as high a rise as we do when we don't have to worry about being delicate with our dough as we're shaping it. That's perfectly fine. The loaf is going to taste extraordinary, and let's taste it right now. All right, I've got a beautiful piece of bread right here. We've got nice roasted garlic cloves inside of it. Oh, y'all. That roasted garlic flavor just permeates the dough, but we also get those luxurious, creamy roasted garlic cloves right in the center as we're biting into it. I don't think I've ever eaten this much bread for an unscreened taste test as I have today. It's because it's so good. Oh man, that is a nice loaf of bread. Of course, with our cross section, you can definitely see we didn't get quite as high a rise, but the texture is still nice and open and it tastes incredible. And of course, 99% of the time you do inclusions with simple sourdough, you're going to use the other technique, which does allow you to get a nice tight boule and a much higher rise. So let's follow up with our dough that we started yesterday. Now, I know my starter really well, and I know that if I did not have inclusions in this dough, after 20 hours, this dough would have been almost all the way to the top of the container. It would have probably tripled or more. But in this case, we have got acidic ingredients in the form of that pickled jalapeno, and we've got extra salt in this dough that's coming from both the pickled jalapenos and the cheese, even though we reduced the salt content that we added to the dough. All that stuff is going to keep the fermentation in check. So don't expect quite as high a rise in your bulk fermentation if you're adding salty or pickled ingredients to your sourdough. All right, let's get this shaped. Not too much flour on the surface. However, if this is your first time using a new inclusion, it's easy to get screwed up on your hydration, especially with wet inclusions, right? So if you discover at this point that your dough is just too sticky to work with, that means you're overhydrated. And that's not the end of the world. All you gotta do is knead in some more flour until the dough becomes workable. In my case, that 2-ounce compensation that I deducted from my water feels like it was just about right. All right, I'm gonna flour my hands and we're gonna get to work shaping this dough. Now, when you do have blocky or chunky inclusions like cheese, they are gonna tend to kind of pop out of that dough as you shape. That's perfectly fine. You can tuck them into the bottom. I'm going to get a really nice tight bowl here. That's activating the gluten structure and going to help our dough rise perfectly. All right, now it is time to put it in our baking vessel. Something to keep in mind of when you are baking with inclusions like cheese is that they can stick themselves to the bottom or sides of the pot because they burn more easily than bread dough does. So it's good insurance when you're incorporating cheese into a loaf to line at least the bottom of your pot with a parchment round. These are wonderful, and I'll link to these in the video description below. Or you can use a regular sheet of parchment. I love these pre-cut parchment sheets because there's nobody in the universe that can tear a sheet of parchment perfectly. Some of my regular viewers note that the best way to use parchment to prevent bread from sticking is to first crumple it up. Straighten it back out. Do that again. Then it will easily conform to the bottom and sides of your pan without crinkling up, which can create creases that bake into the bottom of the loaf. So if you have real concerns about sticking, lining either just the bottom or the bottom and sides of the pot will help provide some insurance against that. Even if you're not dealing with an inclusion like cheese that can actually burn to the surface of the Dutch oven and stick the bread to it, you always risk overhydrating your dough when you use inclusions that bring moisture to the table. And an overhydrated dough is more likely to fuse to your Dutch oven and cause sticking. So, when you're working with inclusions, it's a good idea to have that extra insurance of a layer of parchment at least between the bottom of the dough and the bottom of the Dutch oven. If it sticks to the side, you can just run your knife around it to loosen it. But if it sticks to the bottom, you're up a creek without a paddle. Jalapeno sharp cheddar bread is done. You would not believe how good my kitchen smells right now, and it's taking everything in my power not to completely tear into this loaf. Now, I do have to confess, I'm supposed to be at the airport in like 15 minutes, so I skimped a little bit on my second proof. So I didn't get quite as nice a rise out of this loaf as I'm accustomed to or was expecting to, but you can blame Southwest Airlines for that. All right, normally we let this cool all the way before we eat it, but I cannot wait. Beautiful interior filled with jalapenos and sharp cheddar. Oh. Oh my God. Oh. That is one of the best sourdough bread experiences I've ever had. That is so good, you guys. Okay, I'm gonna take this on the plane with me. But I hope this video has given you a little bit more insight into the potential pitfalls of additions and inclusions to your sourdough. If you found this video informative, I'd really appreciate it if you'd subscribe to my channel. At the very least, give me a like and drop me a comment in the thread below. Let me know what your favorite inclusions are for sourdough. And maybe your input will inspire somebody else to create something of their own. For tons of free printable recipes and more, hit me up on my website, ultimatefoodgeek.com. That's me, Ben Starr, the Ultimate Food Geek. Thanks for watching.